So, it's my pleasure today to introduce our first speaker of the day. Dr. Doug Tallamy is a T.A. Baker Professor of Agriculture and Natural Resources in the Department of Entomology and Wildlife Ecology at the University of Delaware. He is the author of several acclaimed books, including Bringing Nature Home, The Living Landscape, Nature's Best Hope, The Nature of Oaks, and most recently, How Can I Help? Saving Nature with Your Yard. Dr. Tallamy is also a co-founder of Homegrown National Park, a grassroots initiative that raises awareness and inspires everyone to address biodiversity by adding native plants and removing invasive ones where we live, work, learn, pray, and play. His message is especially relevant to urban forestry professionals today in cities and suburbs where fragmented landscapes challenge ecological resilience. Dr. Tallamy's research and advocacy offer practical, science-based strategies for reconnecting people, plants, and wildlife. Please help me join in welcoming Dr. Doug Tallamy.
Thanks very much. I'm the first speaker, so if I go long, it's going to ruin the whole day. So we're going to jump right in. I want to talk to you about my idea of what nature's best hope is, but let's talk about what E.O. Wilson's idea was. Very famous entomologist at Harvard. One thing that was consistent throughout his long career was his love of life on planet Earth and his efforts to save it. And he wanted to save it not just because he loved it, but because he knew it was essential to our own survival. So in 2016, he wrote this book, Half Earth, Our Planet's Fight for Life, and he had one simple message. He said, if we're going to save life anywhere on planet Earth, we're going to have to save nature. We're going to have to save functioning ecosystems on at least half of the planet, or it's going to disappear everywhere, and that includes humans. And he spent most of the book talking about the science that supports that very bold statement. And then he ended the book. He didn't spend a lot of time telling us how we were going to save nature on half of planet Earth. Of course, to a conservation biologist, that's a great idea. We'll just put half the Earth aside and everything that's in trouble can be in that half. We can be in the other half and it'll be great. Problem is, half of terrestrial Earth is already in some form of agriculture. And I don't see that disappearing anytime soon. And we have now 8.3 billion people in the other half, along with all of our hardscape and airports and roadways and detritus. And we don't have a third half to put aside for nature. So how can we realize E.O. Wilson's dream? That's what I really want to talk about today. I think we can, but we need a new approach to landscaping, a new approach to conservation to do that. Before we talk about that, though, let's talk about what happens periodically when you have oak trees around. You have what we call a mast. They all get together and make their acorns at the same time, and that's what it looks like when they do that. Well, I'm easily entertained, so I like to take one of those acorns and just stare at it. And last time I did that, I was rewarded because an insect started to chew its way out of the acorn. First it chewed a little hole for its head, then it forced its head through there, then it forced its entire body through there. It's a very tight squeeze. And after it's out of the acorn, it's a dangerous time for that larva because a lot of things want to eat it. So it gets to safety by wiggling and squirming beneath the soil surface. That takes about 30 seconds. Once it's underground, it stretches in all directions and forms a chamber. And within the chamber converts itself to a pupa. And then it stays underground in that chamber as a pupa for 2 years. After 2 years, comes out as an acorn weevil. That's what an acorn weevil looks like. A lot of people think weevils have big noses because it looks like they do, but that's actually an extension of the head capsule. And the mouth parts are way down there at the end of that extension. They take those mouth parts, chew a hole into the center of the acorn, turn around and lay an egg in that hole, and that is how the larva gets into the acorn. Why do they spend 2 years underground? Why don't they come out the next year the way most insects would? Well, it takes red oak acorns in particular 18 months to complete their development. So if they came out the next year, there wouldn't be enough acorns for them. After they leave the acorn, it leaves a hole, kind of like a true vacuum. And you know that nature abhors a vacuum. And in this case, she has filled it with 3 species of temnothorax ants. Tiny little ants where the entire colony lives in the holes made by acorn weevils after they've left the acorn. And if scouts find a new hole in a new acorn, they get all excited because their old acorn's falling apart. So I tell everybody, it's time to move. Grab the larvae, grab the eggs, move the entire colony into the new acorn. That takes about 30 minutes. And once they're in there, they post a guard, make sure nobody else comes in. And that's where they live for the next 2 years until that acorn falls apart. What's my point with this little story? That's just one of literally millions of very specialized interactions, largely between animals and plants, that it describes the bulk of nature. This is another one. This is the relationship between jays and acorns. Jays are the primary disperser of oak acorns. They'll take an acorn, they'll fly up to a mile, sometimes a mile and a half, from the parent tree, then they tap it below the surface of the soil, and the object is they're going to go back in the wintertime and have something to eat. But for every 4 acorns they bury, they only remember where one is. So for every 4 acorns they bury, they've actually planted 3 oak trees. Specialized relationship between pileated woodpeckers and carpenter ants. That's what they rear their young on, carpenter ants. So you won't have pileated woodpeckers unless you have a lot of carpenter ants, and you won't have carpenter ants unless you have the big trees that make those carpenter ants. You won't have this bee, Andrena facilia, unless you have facilia. That is the only pollen that that bee can rear its young on. It turns out pollen specialization is very common in our native bees. We have between 3,500 and 4,000 species of native bees, and over a third of them can only reproduce in the pollen of particular plants. You won't have the Baltimore checker spot unless you have white turtlehead. I could talk all day, all week, all year about nature-specialized relationships, but the point I want to make today is that actually most of these relationships, nature itself, it's in trouble, it's on the ropes. And it's on the ropes because we didn't take Teddy Roosevelt's advice. Way back in 1908, Teddy heard that the state of Arizona was going to mine the Grand Canyon. So he went to the canyon, looked out over the edge, and he said, "Leave it as it is." And with those 5 words, he started the process of creating the Grand Canyon National Park. Well, we didn't leave most of the lower 48 states as they were. There's only about 5% that's anything close to its original pristine ecological condition, and those are largely mountaintops. And that's because we have logged the country repeatedly, we have tilled it, we have drained it, we have grazed it, got 770 million acres of rangeland. That's what, 2.5, 3.5 times the size of Texas, dedicated to cattle. And of course we paved it or otherwise developed it. We have straightened our rivers and dammed them. You can spell that any way you want. We've polluted our skies, changed our climate for centuries to come. We've drained our aquifers. We've introduced more than 3,300 species of plants from other continents, many of which are running amok in our natural areas. In short, we've carved up those natural areas into tiny remnants of their former selves. And each one of those remnants is too small and too isolated to sustain the amount of nature that we humans need to sustain us. Edwin Wade Teal decades ago said we cannot make the world uninhabitable for other forms of life and have it habitable for ourselves. It's just plain common sense. Yet that's what we're doing. That's what we have done. So why? I don't know. But I suspect we thought that our nest, planet Earth, was so large we could foul it forever and there wouldn't be any consequences. Well, we were wrong about that. That's why we're seeing some pretty scary headlines these days, like the insect apocalypse is here. What does it mean for the rest of life on Earth? Talking about global insect decline. Followed by this one, North America's lost 3 billion breeding birds in the last 50 years. It's a third of our North American bird population already gone. UN's predicting we're going to lose 1 million species to extinction in the next 20 years, and they made that prediction 3 years ago. So now I guess it's the next 17 years. Now it's a prediction. It hasn't happened yet, and we have to make sure it doesn't happen because those are the species that run the ecosystems that we all depend on. So I could go on talking about the pox that we humans have delivered upon the environment, and as Shakespeare would say, upon all of our houses. But that's not what this talks about. This talks about a cure for that pox. It's a cure that'll take small efforts from lots of people like you and me, but those efforts will make enormous physical, psychological, and environmental benefits for everybody. Let's return briefly to this headline, the insect apocalypse is here. What does it mean for the rest of life on Earth? Well, back to E.O. Wilson. He told us what would happen if Earth lost its insects, and he did it way back in 1987 with this paper, The Little Things That Run the World. And again, his message was very clear. Life as we know it depends on insects. And if they were to disappear, so would most of our flowering plants. And if most of our flowering plants disappeared, it would so drastically change energy flow through our terrestrial ecosystems that the food webs that support our vertebrate animals would collapse. We'd lose our amphibians, our reptiles, our birds, and our mammals. The biosphere, the living portion of the Earth, would rot because we would have lost insect decomposers that rapidly turn over nutrients, and all we'd have is bacteria and fungi. And again, humans wouldn't survive any of those drastic changes. Now, there is good news, and that is that none of that has to happen. We can save our insects, we can save our birds, we can save nature itself, but we're going to have to change the way we landscape to do it. Why is that? Remember, humans are products of nature. We are totally dependent on the life support that nature provides. We call them ecosystem services. These are just a few things that plants do every day that we depend on every day, like produce oxygen, like clean our water, slow its journey to the sea, or it becomes too salty to use. Carbon capture, enormously important today. Plants are pulling carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere, building their tissues out of that carbon, and then pumping the extra carbon they fix through photosynthesis into the ground, where once it's in the ground, it's very, very stable. Plants are building topsoil, they're holding it in place, they're preventing floods, they're dampening severe weather, they're converting sunlight into food. If we lose our plants, we're going to have to eat sunlight, and then we will lose weight. What do animals do? Lots of things. We'll provide pest control services for those plants, pollinating nearly 90% of our flowering plants, dispersing plant seeds. So designing landscapes like this that destroy the production of ecosystem services is just not a good idea. Never was a good idea, but today it's a terrible idea because of those 8.3 billion people that are demanding more and more ecosystem services every day. Now, we do have parks, we do have preserves. They're doing the best they can, but we are in the 6th great extinction event that the planet has ever experienced, so it's obviously not good enough. So I think the answer is to practice conservation outside of parks and preserves on landscapes just like that. Now, there have been visionaries through the ages who recognized that we humans needed to work on our relationship with planet Earth, and Aldo Leopold was one of the most eloquent. He wrote extensively in the first half of the 1900s. One of the things he said is the oldest task in human history is to live on a piece of land without spoiling it. There have been indigenous groups who've been able to do that for long periods, but our huge Western societies and our huge Asian societies are terrible at doing that. We habitually take more from the earth than it has to offer, completely wrecking an area, going to another area, doing the same thing. Not sustainable behavior. But Aldo Leopold had a lot of faith in humans. He believed we were capable of developing what he called a land ethic. He knew we had to use the land. We had to farm and lumber and graze and mine and do all those things. But he believed we could learn to do them gently enough that we did not destroy local ecosystems. That's what he called the land ethic, and he wrote about it in the Sand County Almanac, his most famous book. What he did not write about, though, was developing a land ethic where we actually lived. I'm not sure why that was, but I suspect the notion that humans and nature cannot live together. We cannot coexist in the same place at the same time. That notion was so deeply embedded in the culture of Aldo Leopold's day, still embedded in our own culture, that he may not have recognized it as an option. So what I want to argue today is that not only is living with nature an option, it is now the only viable option that's left to us. In the past, of course, conservationists worked pretty much exclusively where there weren't a lot of people. We now need to turn that on its head and practice conservation where there are a lot of people, because that's pretty much everywhere. And that means we've got to find ways for nature to thrive in human-dominated landscapes. Not hang on by a thread, not get diminished every year, but thrive. Where should we start? Private property. Why? Because most of the country's privately owned. 78% of the lower 48 states is privately owned. 85.6% east of the Mississippi is privately owned. If we don't practice conservation on private property, we're going to fail, and failure is not an option. Now, we use the word conservation. I'm not using it exactly the way I mean. We do want to conserve as much nature out there as we can. That's been our conservation model for the last century. But it's obviously not good enough. So we have to go beyond conservation into restoration. We have to rebuild nature in as many places as we possibly can. And if you're thinking, well, there's no way you're going to put it back together again exactly the way it was, you are probably right. We've changed too many things. But we can reunite enough of those specialized interactions I started the talk with to create ecosystem function once again, even if it's not exactly what was on a particular space at some point in the past. But not all species contribute to ecosystem function equally, so we have to start with the building blocks, the most important groups, and there's two groups that we can't do without. One is the flowering plants, and of course the pollinators that allow those plants to reproduce. They are capturing energy from the sun and turning it into food and storing it in their plant parts. So now we have most of the food stored in plant parts, mostly leaves. If you don't get that food to animals, you don't have any animals. And if you don't have any animals, you don't have functional ecosystems. Well, it turns out that most vertebrates don't eat plants directly. Most vertebrates eat invertebrates that ate those plants. Most of those invertebrates are insects, and not just any insect. Turns out that caterpillars are extremely important in terms of transferring energy from plants to other animals. They are transferring more energy from plants to other animals than any other type of plant eater. Dan Jansen, very famous ecologist, calls them the meat and potatoes of terrestrial food webs. So if we design landscapes that don't have a lot of caterpillars in them, we're going to have failed food webs and eventually failed ecosystems. I'm going to use the Carolina chickadee as an example. That's the chickadee we have right here, the ones that are at our feeders all winter long, eating seeds. And we tend to think that's all chickadees need is seeds. Well, even in the wintertime, only 50% of their diet is seeds. The other 50% is insects and spiders, even in the wintertime. And when it comes time to rear their young, their babies can't eat seeds at all. And that's true for most of the birds out there. Babies can't eat seeds. So they switch to invertebrates, and if they're in a healthy environment, they will rear their young exclusively on caterpillars. And they are not alone. 96% of our terrestrial birds rear their young on insects, and most of those insects are caterpillars. So there's something special about caterpillars. What is it? There's actually several things special about caterpillars, and one of them is that they're soft. So think of this guy as like a little sausage with a very thin wrapper. The thin wrapper is its exoskeleton. It's made of chitin. It's undigestible. And because they're soft, you can stuff them down the throat of your offspring without fear of injuring them. If you've ever watched a parent bird, they're pretty rough. Beaks like a plunger. Caterpillars are also relatively large prey items. One medium-sized caterpillar is equal to the biomass of 200 aphids. Now, many of our smaller birds do chase aphids around. But do you want to chase 200 aphids or get one caterpillar? They are nutritious, they're very high in fat, very high in protein, low percentage of chitin of exoskeleton compared to other insects, particularly beetles. Beetles are not like little sausages, they're like little tanks. So much of a beetle is undigestible, and a lot of beetles have very sharp edges too. And finally, it turns out that caterpillars are the best source of carotenoids for birds during the breeding season. I mentioned carotenoids not because I love organic chemistry, but because I'm a vertebrate. You're a vertebrate. Birds are vertebrates. We vertebrates cannot make our own carotenoids. Only plants make carotenoids, so we have to get our carotenoids from plants. And we have to get them from plants because carotenoids are essential components of vertebrate diets. So where are the birds getting their carotenoids from? Particularly during the breeding season, they're from all those things they bring back to the nest. But look, carotenoid content is not equally distributed among bird prey items. Those two bars all the way over there are caterpillars. They have far more carotenoids than other types of bird prey. Here's the adult caterpillars, the moths and butterflies themselves. They have far fewer carotenoids because they're not eating the green leaves. That's where the carotenoids are. And there's the earthworm way over there. So the early bird gets the worm, but he doesn't get any carotenoids when he gets the worm. So that study and others are suggesting that caterpillars are not optional parts of bird diets. They are essential parts of most bird diets. So let's just say most birds need caterpillars. The next question is, how many do they need? Is one or two enough? Or one or two a day enough? It's a good question. So let's go back to Carolina chickadees. There's a lot of data on Carolina chickadees. How many caterpillars does it take to make a Carolina chickadee? One or two is not enough. One or two a day is not enough. It takes thousands, 6,000 to 9,000 caterpillars to get one clutch of chickadees, depending on the number of chicks in the nest, to the point where they leave the nest. And after they leave the nest, the parents continue to feed them caterpillars another 21 days. So you're really talking about tens of thousands of caterpillars required to make one nest of a bird that's a third of an ounce. That's 4 pennies worth of bird. And if you want chickadees to breed in your yard, you got to have all those caterpillars in your yard because they only forage about 50 meters from the nest. They're not flying 5 miles down the road to the nearest woodlot. And if we landscape in a way that does not include all those caterpillars, that's called insect decline. And it's really looking like insect decline is one of the major causes of bird declines that people are measuring these days. We went to the original data set of Rosenberg et al. That's the Smithsonian group who said we've lost 3 billion breeding birds in the last 50 years, and we divided the terrestrial bird species into 2 groups. The species that require insects, particularly when they're breeding, and the species that do not require insects. So things like doves and finches and crossbills can actually make a little milk out of the seeds they eat, and they don't need insects. And look, that group did not decline at all in the last 50 years. But the birds that require insects declined on average 10 million individuals per species. It doesn't prove cause and effect, but it does suggest that as you take bird food away, you lose the birds. So we need to raise the bar about what we're asking our landscape to do. In the past, we've asked them to do one thing, be pretty. Now we're going to ask them to do 2 things, be pretty and ecologically functional at the same time, and that's not going to happen if we don't put the caterpillars back. How do you add caterpillars to a landscape? We add the plants that support those caterpillars. Seems pretty straightforward, But there is a catch, and that is that most plants do not support a lot of caterpillars. So you have to be fussy about it. You have to be fussy about which plants we put in our landscapes, and we have to be fussy about it because the caterpillars themselves are fussy about it. We can have all the calorie pear and all the burning bush and all the ginkgos and all the hostas and all the things we typically landscape with in our yards, and you won't make a single monarch butterfly. The only thing that's going to make a monarch butterfly is one of the milkweeds. That's called host plant specialization. And it turns out that most of the insects that eat plants are host plant specialists. They can only eat particular plants. Why is that? Remember, plants don't want to be eaten. They want to capture the energy from the sun and use it for their own growth and reproduction. So they've loaded the leaves with nasty tasting chemicals, secondary metabolic compounds that make those leaves either bitter or downright toxic. And it's a really effective defense that keeps most of the insects of the world from eating most of the plants of the world, which is why it's green out there in the summertime. It's not because there's no insects out there that want to eat those plants. It's because most of the insects that are out there cannot eat most of the plants. They are too well protected. There's a reason it's hard to get our kids to eat their vegetables. They inherently know they're toxic. But insects do eat plants, so how do they do that? How do they get around those chemical defenses? This is where the specialization comes in. 90% of the insects that eat plants can only eat plants for which they have very specialized adaptations that disarm the plant, that circumvent those chemical defenses. Specialized enzymes that store and excrete and detoxify those compounds. Behavioral adaptations and life history adaptations that minimize their exposure to the compounds. But it takes a long period of evolutionary history for all those adaptations to fall into place. And once they do, the insect is locked into eating that particular plant. So if you take the milkweeds out of your yard and replace them with hostas, the monarch's not going to be able to start making a living on your hostas. It's got two choices then: fly away and find milkweed someplace else, or starve to death. Three kinds of plants out there: plants that contribute energy to local food webs, plants that do not contribute energy to local food webs, and plants that remove energy from local food webs. The very best contributor in 84% of the counties in which they occur is one of our oaks. They are contributing more energy to local food webs than any other plant genus by far. Good example of a non-contributor would be a ginkgo. Ginkgo biloba from Asia. It's a nice ornamental plant, has good fall color, but nothing eats a ginkgo, so it's not adding any energy to local food webs. And a good example of a detractor would be any of the invasive ornamentals that are contributing very little energy to local food webs, but they are not staying where we plant them. They're escaping, and they push out the contributors that do support our food webs. We've measured this in invaded habitats a number of times. And on average, you lose about 96% of the caterpillar biomass. So that if caterpillars are bird food, you've just lost 96% of the bird food when we allow these invasions to take place. So all I'm saying is that plant choice matters. We are not going to restore functional ecosystems if we don't have functional food webs in those ecosystems, and we're not going to have functional food webs unless we have the plants that support them. And I'm going to give you 3 examples of how well this works when we do use the right plants, starting with where Cindy and I moved. My wife Cindy in the year 2000, it was a farm in Oxford, Pennsylvania, broken up into 10-acre lots. We got one of those lots. It had been mowed for hay before we moved in, so very few plants there. And our job was to restore the eastern deciduous ecosystem, which we had never done. We didn't know what we were doing. Well, one of the things I wanted to try was to put a caterpillar host plant there and see whether the caterpillar came. See if that moth actually colonized my little planting. And the first one I tried was the Canadian owlet. I'd never even seen a Canadian owlet before. It's a pretty little thing. That's what the adult looks like, just like a leaf. Well, you're not going to have Canadian owlets unless you have its host plant, meadow-rue, host plant specialization. We didn't have any meadow-rue. I'm sure it was there 300 years ago before the area was farmed to death, but meadow-rue long gone. So I got some meadow-rue seeds, planted them. They grew very nicely. But this was early on, and I actually had very little faith that meadow-rue would be able to, or that Canadian owl would be able to find my little patch of meadow-rue. So I didn't even go out and check it for about, it must have been 3 months after I planted it. And then I was walking by for another reason, and I looked over, it was covered with Canadian owlets. They had found it right away. I'm still impressed with that. So now I've got a good population of meadow-rue and Canadian owlets. We've added 2 species to that ecosystem. Same story with the goldenrod stowaway. Misnomer, that beautiful moth has nothing to do with goldenrod. It's a specialist on that plant, Biden's aristosa. Ditch daisy We didn't have any Bidens aristosa, but there was there's a good population of Bidens in a power line cut about 14 miles away. So I got some seeds, I planted them. They grew very nicely. As a matter of fact, last year they took over my front yard. That's okay. Well, I had to wait a year for the goldenrod stowaway to find my patch of Bidens, but it did. Now we've got a good population of both of those, so we've added 4 species. Hackberry emperor, want to see if it could make a living at our house, not because it's the most beautiful butterfly in the world, but because it belongs there. It's one of the species that ought to be there. But as its name suggests, it's a specialist on hackberry and on celtis, and we didn't have any hackberry. So I got a couple of hackberry trees, I planted them. I had to wait 4 years for the hackberry emperor to come and colonize my hackberry, but they did. So now we've added 6 species to the property, and that is how the restoration proceeded. I did not plant goldenrod, came in on its own, and so did all the things, or many of the things that depend on goldenrod, like the brown-hooded owlet, the Arcidura flower moth, the goldenrod leaf miner, the distinct Sparaginothus, the goldenrod gall moth. There are 110 species of moths that use goldenrod in this area. Planted Virginia creeper. Yes, Virginia creeper. I've heard people don't like that. But it's a great native plant. It's got good fall color, can climb our trees without girdling them, without pulling them down, makes valuable berries for the birds in the fall. And by valuable, I mean they are high in fat. Our migrating birds need fat, and our overwintering birds need fat to help them get through the winter. And those berries come from tiny little inconspicuous flowers. Let me see. No, I don't have it there. You don't even know when Virginia creeper is in bloom until you see this big cloud of native bees around it. It turns out it's an excellent pollinator plant. So remember, when you're making a pollinator garden, you're making it for the pollinators. If it's not big and showy for you, that's okay. I planted Virginia creeper because it's the best host plant for the large sphinx moths that are a primary component of cardinal diets. Things like the Pandora sphinx and its beautiful adult, the lettered sphinx, the hog sphinx, the abbot sphinx, all on Virginia creeper. I want to see if I can get the double-toothed prominent at our house because it's such a cool looking caterpillar. It looks like a stegosaurus. What's a specialist on elm, particularly American elm? Of course, we didn't have any American elm. Lost it decades ago to the Dutch elm disease. But there are 2 big American elms at the University of Delaware that did not die. Every year they make a lot of seed. I got some of those seeds. I planted them at home. They germinate in 6 days. They grow very quickly. Today those trees are over 80 feet tall. None of them have died. And they did bring in the double-toothed prominent American elm. Why the evening primrose moth at our house? Because it's beautiful. I like beauty like anybody else. Well, we didn't have any evening primrose, so I planted that. The moth did come, spends the day with its head stuffed in the flowers. Sometimes it's crowded, but it's always very cute. And I planted lots of oaks. Now, those are just examples of the plants we put on our property, but I want to focus on oaks for a while because they are such important plants. That is the Bedford oak in Bedford, New York. Martha Stewart land. People argue about whether it's 400 years old or 500 years old. It is enormous. And people say, I'm not going to plant an oak because I won't live long enough to enjoy it. And if you can only enjoy your oak when it's 400 years old, you're right, you won't. But if you can enjoy what your oak is contributing to your local food web, you can enjoy it right away. And I can say that with confidence because I planted most of my oaks as acorns, which means they were free, or 2-foot bare root webs, which means they cost $1.50 each. And immediately they started to bring in the moths that lay the caterpillars that run the food web at our house. Things like the solitary oak leaf miner, Juvenil's dusky wing, the yellow-shouldered moth, Suzuki's promolactus, the red-washed caterpillar, the yellow-vested moth, the orange-tufted oneida, the spiny oak caterpillar, the 2-spotted oak punky, the variable oak leaf caterpillar, the red-humped oakworm, the pink-striped oakworm, the hesitant dagger moth, the lesser oak dagger moth, the medium dagger moth, the greater oak dagger moth, the streaked dagger moth, the afflicted dagger moth, the crown bucolatrix, the orange-patched smoky wing, the white-blotched heterocampa, the oblique heterocampa, the red-line panapoda, the laugher, and literally hundreds more species of caterpillars. I would clap for oaks too if I wasn't holding this. And look, they come right away. That is a pin oak that's popped its head above the leaves, and there's a caterpillar standing on the ground eating the leaves of that tree. So you don't have to wait decades or hundreds of years for your oak to start to contribute. It will do it right away. Has life returned to our property? After we put the plants back, you can measure life any way you want. I'm counting the number of breeding bird species that have bred there and the number of moth species on our property. I'm still at it. Take a picture of every moth I can find. And I'm up to, 1,365. I found another one the other night. So. So who knows when I'll find all the ones that are making a living there. And because so many of those are types of bird food, we have recorded 62 species of birds that have bred on our 10 acres. Not flew by, but bred. Why am I telling you this? Well, this is another headline we see all the time. World Wildlife Fund says that Earth has lost 2/3 of its wildlife since 1970. It's a terrible statistic. But I'm thinking, gee, not at our house. I'm convinced we have increased biodiversity by more than 2/3. It didn't take that long, and it wasn't that hard. We just put the plants back. What would happen if everybody put the plants back? We really could turn a lot of these headlines around. But will it work on smaller properties, let's say in suburbia? Excellent question. So let's go to Margie and Dan Terpster's house in Kirkwood, Missouri. They have 0.6 acres, 18 times less land than Cindy and I have. They're in the middle of a development. The yard's choked with bush honeysuckle, Amur honeysuckle. So the first thing they did was get rid of that. Then they planted 70 species of native plants, put in a water feature that they call a bubbler, and then they started to count the birds using their yard, and they are up to 154 bird species, including an amazing 35 warbler species. We've only counted 18 warbler species at our house. So does it work on smaller properties? Yes, it does. What about urban yards? Let's go to Pam Carlson's house in Chicago. And I mean in Chicago. Her property abuts O'Hare Airport. She has 1/10 of an acre, 3 times smaller than the average lot size in North America. She's not connected to any natural area at all. It's a pretty little island in the middle of Chicago because Pam is a native plant landscaper. But she did the same thing. She got rid of her non-native plants, put in 60 species of native plants, another water feature, and then she sat back, she says, with a glass of wine, and started to count the birds using her property, and she is up to 127 bird species, including a woodcock. There's Pam's woodcock. There are 4 things we need to do if we're going to succeed in a big way, and the first one is to think about those big lawns. We've got more than 44 million acres of lawn in this country. That is an area bigger than New England, dedicated to an ecological deadscape. Why do we do that? Well, it's a status symbol, very important status symbol. We like neat, and we have to display our Halloween decorations. There are 4 things every property needs to do if we're going to reach any kind of a sustainable relationship with planet Earth. That is support a food web, sequester carbon, manage the watershed in which it lies, and support pollinators. Lawns does none of those things. That's why I pick on it. So what if we cut the area of lawn in half? What if let's make the math simple. We've got 40 million acres of lawn. We're going to cut that in half. That'll give us 20 million acres that we can restore right at home. And that is what we're going to create Homegrown National Park out of. And it will be big. It'll be bigger than the Adirondacks, plus Yellowstone, plus Yosemite, plus Grand Tetons, Canyonlands, Mount Rainier, North Cascades, Badlands National Park, Olympic National Park, Sequoia National Park, plus the Grand Canyon, plus Denali, which is huge, plus the Great Smoky Mountains. Add up all those parks, still less than 20 million acres, so Homegrown National Park will be the biggest park in the country. It's a real thing. You can go to our website, homegrownnationalpark.org, and register your property on the biodiversity map. Where you are and the amount of area you are either being a good steward of or are pledging to be a good steward of. And when you do that, your little piece of your county is going to light up with a firefly, and of course, the object is to get the entire country to light up with a firefly, and Canada's playing this game now too. Our mission is very simple. We want to motivate millions of people to regenerate biodiversity in the way that you regenerate biodiversity. By putting the native plants that support it into our yards, removing the non-native plants that do not, and in so doing, building a culture that's sympathetic to the needs of conservation. There are real ecological products associated with Homegrown National Park, and one's a significant increase in biodiversity. And what's happened at our house convinces me this works. It really does work. Nature's enormously resilient if we give her half a chance. Measurable reduction in invasive species. If everybody removed the invasive plants just from their property, we'd be 78% done, 85% done in the east. Not completely, but a very good first step. Significant drawdown of atmospheric CO2. Lawn is the worst plant for sequestering carbon, so if we reduce the area of lawn, we're going to help climate change, and we're also going to start to build viable habitat outside of parks and preserves. Any bit of conservation you do outside of a park is going to help conservation inside of the park. There are also important sociological products. associated with Homegrown National Park, and one is national awareness, not just of what the problems are, but what the solutions are, and what our roles in those solutions are. We want to change the culture. We want people to recognize nature's not optional. It's not just there for our entertainment. It's essential. It's essential for everybody, which means everybody has a role, responsibility in sustaining it. We want to convert hope into action. Hope is good, but action's even better. And we want to merge all of the existing conservation organizations into one visual, the biodiversity map. There's a lot of good conservation happening in Audubon, National Wildlife Federation, and so on private property, but nobody's measuring that. So that is the goal. Did I mention Homegrown National Park is free? We are not competing with other organizations. We think of ourselves as a movement, not an organization, but we're all on the same page. We just want to record all the good conservation that's happening on private property. Okay, we're going to reduce the lawn. What plants should we put in the area that was once lawn? I'm going to say keystone plants, the most important plants. Remember what a keystone is? It's the stone in the middle of the Roman arch. If you take that stone out of the arch collapses. Well, if you take keystone plants out of your local food web, the food web collapses because they're making most of the food. Just 14% of our native plants are supporting 90% of the caterpillars that drive those food webs. So think of the keystone plants in the ecological houses you're building as the 2x4s that support that house. They're the support system. You can't build a house out of wallpaper, and that's what we've been trying to do for the last century. Best keystone plant, I already said this, in 84% of the counties in which they occur is oaks, 557 species of caterpillars in the mid-Atlantic states. And it's now over 1,000 species nationwide. And again, no other plant genus comes close to that. If you want to know what the best plants are where you live, you go to Native Plant Finder and the National Wildlife Federation website, put in your zip code, and the rank list of the most important woody and herbaceous plants in your county will pop up. Okay, we're going to shrink the lawn. We're going to use keystone plants. We're going to invite a lot of insects to our yard, and then we're going to kill them with our security light, which is not the goal. It turns out light pollution is one of the major causes of insect declines. Those are all the ways that lights are killing our insects, and we got a lot of lights out there, folks. It's an extremely important environmental issue, but it has a very, very easy solution. First of all, you could turn those lights out, but if you don't want to do that, you could put a motion sensor on your light so it only turns on when the bad man comes, which is not that often. Or even easier, take the white bulb out of your light and put in a yellow bulb. Yellow wavelengths do not attract nocturnal insects. So overnight, if we switched out our white bulbs for yellow bulbs, we could save millions of insects. And if you use yellow LEDs, you could save millions of dollars too. So we're going to shrink the lawn. We're going to use keystone plants. We're going to modify our light system. Then we're going to invite one of the mosquito foggers to come kill all of our insects. Booming business around the country. They say it's okay because it's an organic, natural product and it only kills mosquitoes. Cyanide is organic and natural too, and so is ricin. Only kills mosquitoes, not even close to that. Kills all the insects it comes in contact with. Going to undergrad looking at non-target effects of mosquito fogging. Everything dies within 24 hours. I mean, it's remarkable. That's the result of a mosquito fogging event on Kent Island a couple of years ago. My friend happened to be there, picked up a bunch of dead monarchs, but he said there were thousands on the ground because it was during a big migration event. All the pollinators were trying to save all the natural enemies, and it only kills about 40% of the mosquitoes. So if you really want to control mosquitoes, you don't do it in the adult stage. You do it in the larval stage. Try mosquito dunks. And I'm not going to take the time to describe it. Or you can put a fan on your picnic table and turn it on. Sit in the directed breeze and the mosquitoes will not come. Okay, the fourth thing we need to do is to landscape in a way that allows those all-important caterpillars to complete their development. And I'm talking about how we landscape under trees. I live in Chester County, Pennsylvania, where oaks support 511 species of caterpillars. A few of them, like the polyphemus moth, complete the development on the tree. The caterpillar eats the leaves, then it spins a cocoon, then it hangs from one of the branches and emerges in the spring. And then it does it all over again. Everything happens on the tree. I wish everything did that, but most species don't. Most species finish developing on the tree, and then they drop from the tree and pupate underground, or they spin a cocoon in the leaf litter that's under the tree, and that's the problem. There is no leaf litter under the tree. We don't tolerate it, and we mow and compact the area around our trees with our mowers, making it really hard for those caterpillars to get underground and survive. And of course, the cement landscape is not the answer either. I had a grad student, Emma Jonas, who graduated last spring, who looked at how well caterpillars do in a situation like this versus a situation like this. And of course, they do better in a situation like this. The factors that are determining caterpillar survivorship is the amount of compaction, soil compaction, and many of these, particularly when you have grass right up to the tree, it's very difficult to get through the thatch, so they pupate right close to the surface. And that means when you walk on it, you squish them. A single footfall is enough to squish a pupa that's a half-inch underground. And of course, mowers going under it squish them as well. So what we want to do is landscape, put beds around our trees to create no-go zones. So you're not walking there, you're not mowing there, and you'll have much higher caterpillar survivorship. This is where you can do your spring ephemeral gardening. It's where you can put in your native ground covers like wild ginger, or that's native pachysandra. There's Virginia creeper as a ground cover. Golden seal, May apples, foam flower ferns. If you can see the ground, you don't have enough plants there. Green mulch, that's the way to go. Your tree will love it, and so will those caterpillars. Can we use natives formally? Of course we can. This is a Lynn O'Shaughnessy design, taken by a drone 400 feet up. You don't get more formal than that, and every plant in that landscape is a native plant. Formality is a function of the design. It's not a function of the plants in the design. Our native plants are used in formal designs in Europe every day. They love them over there. If Europeans can love our native plants, maybe we can too. Ooh. Can we get a pollinator garden into a typical yard like this without offending anybody? Yes, we can. Just put a little fence around it. It formalizes it. It tells your neighbor it's not just a bunch of weeds you forgot to mow. It's not very big, but it's servicing several species of bees, so it's helping. And if everybody did it, it would help a lot. Help what? Help make pollinators. Why do we need pollinators? The media says because they pollinate 1/3 of our crops. It's actually closer to about 1/12 of our crops. And it's a very anthropocentric view about why we need pollinators. We need pollinators because they're pollinating 80% of all plants and 90% of all flowering plants, including a few of our crops. But losing our pollinators is not an option. Where do we need pollinators? Everywhere we need plants, which is everywhere. This is a Drew Latham design. Imagine the amount of life here versus the amount of life here. Seems like a no-brainer. Can municipalities help us live with nature? Yes, they can. More and more of them are doing it. Minnesota's been doing it for a number of years now. They have a cost-sharing program which is encouraging homeowners to convert some or all of their lawn to appropriate Minnesota prairie plants. Other states are adopting that. Marco Island for Florida is paying residents to allow burrowing owls to burrow in the front yard. Burrowing owls are listed species. This is the way the Endangered Species Act should have been written, with carrots rather than sticks. If you have an endangered species on your property, we're going to pay you to take care of it rather than fine you if you use your property. Everybody would want an endangered species. Put a bounty on things like calorie pear. That's what St. Louis, Missouri did. Fayetteville, Arkansas, North Carolina. Take out a calorie pear, you get a free tree replacement. And of course, the big lawn reduction programs in the far west. That's going up. You get a $3 rebate for every square foot of lawn you remove in California. All right, we made 3 missteps in the early years of conservation. The first one is serious. We're starting to think of nature as if it's optional. We like it. We like to go bird watching, walk around, but it's not essential. And if it's not essential, when push comes to shove, when resources are in short supply, nature takes a back seat. And of course, resources are always in short supply. I went to the Cincinnati Zoo, and there's this wall-size poster there, which to me epitomizes our society's view of conservation. We want to save nature, save wildlife, so that future generations can enjoy it. That was Teddy Roosevelt's argument for creating the national park system. Beautiful places, we want to save them so that future generations can enjoy them. And I get that, because nature's enormously entertaining, but it is much more than that. We want to save nature so that we have future generations. It's a little bit more urgent. We've also assumed that humans and nature cannot coexist. Now, we talked about that. If we restrict conservation just to the places where there are very few humans, we're going to fail, because those places are now too small, too few, and too isolated. David Quammen has a wonderful analogy between a Persian rug and an ecosystem. That is a functional Persian rug. That's not 71 Persian rugs. That's 71 rug fragments, none of which are acting like a Persian rug, and that's what we've done to our ecosystems. The UN designates biosphere reserves as places of ecological significance, and I don't like that language because it suggests there's places on planet Earth with no ecological significance. Not so. Every square inch of the planet has ecological significance, including our yards, including our corporate landscapes, including our roadsides, including our cities, even including much of our agriculture. So we need to glue our rug back together again, folks. We need to put the plants back, particularly the trees, and that's what this conference is all about. Our third misstep is to leave Earth stewardship to just a few specialists, a few conservation biologists, a few ecologists. For some reason, we didn't see it as an inherent responsibility of everybody on the planet, but I don't know why, since every single person on the planet depends entirely on the quality of local ecosystems. So why wouldn't everybody bear the responsibility of taking care of them? Stan Rushworth, the Cherokee elder, once said the Western settler mindset was, I have rights. The mindset of indigenous people is, I have obligations. You're not born with those mindsets, we're taught them. We've been really good at teaching this, we've been terrible at teaching this. That doesn't mean you have to save biodiversity for a living, but you can save it where you live, and if you do, it empowers you. More and more people are upset about the state of the planet, but they feel powerless. What can one person do? One person can shrink the lawn, one person can use keystone plants, one person can fire mosquito Joe, one person can put in a pollinator garden, one person can remove their invasive species, one person can do a whole bunch of things to revitalize their property and then enhance their local ecosystem instead of continuing to degrade it. And it shrinks the problem down to something that's manageable for each one of us. Don't think about the entire planet's problems. You get depressed. Just worry about the piece of the earth that you can influence. If you own property, it's obvious. That's where you start. If you don't own property, help somebody who does. Help a land conservancy, help a park or a preserve. They're all underfunded, they're all understaffed, they will love you as a volunteer. So as a property owner or a volunteer, each one of us has the power, and we certainly have the responsibility to turn landscapes like that into landscapes like that. And whether or not we do so is going to determine nature's fate and then ultimately our own. Thank you very much.
Hi, I'm just wondering where most of what you showed was Lepidoptera, and I'm wondering if Hymenoptera plays a part in that at all in terms of grubs, sawfly, maggots, etc.
Plays a part.
Birds.
You know, there are a few birds that are specialists on bees, like the western tanager and thing, but not very many. Bees are not a huge part of it. And the tiny little parasitoids, no, not very much. They're crucial in terms of controlling populations, but not in terms of the food web. So.
Are all oaks equal?
Are all oaks equal in terms of supporting caterpillars? Nobody knows. We compared 16 species that you can find in this area, and they were very close. The only ones that underperformed were the ones that were really out of range, like water oak. We did this up in Delaware. Water oak and willow oak are a little above their normal distribution, and they didn't support quite as much. The white oak group outcompeted the red oak group a little bit. I don't think it's statistically significant. So I wouldn't worry about that. I would worry about planting the right oak for your situation. You know, we have oaks that like acid soil, basic soil, rocky outcrops, wetlands, so you want to pick the one that works and just be confident that it will help. Non-native oaks are not going to measure up, so to pick a native oak, we got 91 species to choose from.
Question about, I guess, industries around landscaping. I really dug your recommendations about addressing urban matters in terms of ecological sustainment, but do you have any recommendations on how to address the needs of landscapers? They bought all this equipment, they have particular kinds of training, that's their livelihood. And so how do we address that particular matter?
Well, notice I am not saying stop landscaping. I am saying change the inventory. So really that's a matter of changing the inventory of the plants we put in our yards. But we still, all these landscapes have to be managed. Native landscapes have to be managed just like non-native landscapes, particularly in terms of keeping out the invasive plants, which are always invading. So I don't see that as an issue. What we want to do is get more and more people that become skilled in, we call it ecological landscaping, so that they can choose the right plants and manage them properly, mow at the right times of year, and so on. But yeah, you can learn everything you need to know in a week to do that. So.
Hi, can you comment on plant selection, particularly native cultivars compared to straight species? because a lot of the nativars I see are more palatable in a landscape than some of the straight species because of the size, particularly.
Oh, they're easier to use in the landscape. Sure, you know, a cultivar, native is a made-up word. It's a cultivar of a native plant, which is it's a genetic variant of that particular species. There are a number of cultivars that were really varieties found in nature and simply brought in. We put a name on them. Others were selected purposely by humans. And yes, a number of cultivars were designed to make it easier to use in landscapes, like taking a tall plant and making it short. That's a big one. We did a study looking at 6 cultivar traits of woody plants, and the only trait that consistently reduced insect use was taking a green leaf and making it red or purple, because you're loading that leaf with anthocyanins, which are feeding deterrents. So I can say with confidence, try to avoid red leaf cultivars. I think they're ugly, but everybody likes them. But you know, tall plant, short, and the other things that we typically select for didn't impact. Introducing disease resistance did not impact the insects. Now, when you start modifying flowers, you're probably going to impact specialist pollinator relationships. Not always. So the real answer is it depends on what the genetic change was. And if you want the latest in terms of comparing straight species with their cultivars in flowering plants, go to the Mount Cuba Center website in Hockessin, Delaware. They've been doing a lot of trial gardening, and they've got all of it up on their website. So you have everything we know is up on that website in terms of flowering plants. Thank you very much.